Hello everyone and welcome to the final list video, which is gonna be my top 50 albums of 2021. So 2021 is a year that I wouldn't consider necessarily to be a great year for music, but I still managed to find 50 albums that I really liked and I do strongly recommend them. So let's just jump straight into it. At number 50, I've got the new album of Current Value, The All Attracting. This is more of the same when it comes to Current Value, just experimenting more with neurofunk sounds, and this is an album that at the end of the day it feels like it's more of the same, which is obviously not a bad thing, but I don't really believe that this one contains some of the greatest ideas. It's a bit of an inconsistent album, but still the production is amazing, it's still an imaginative album and there are some great ideas to it. Number 49 is the collaborative project between Merzbow and Prurient, which I'm actually quite surprised that it hasn't happened sooner. And the thing is that I believe that both of those artists are not at their peak currently. They don't offer some of their greatest material, and it kinda shows with this particular release. I would expect more, but still this is a pretty solid album that shows the capabilities of both sides and managing to do what they know best in their respective styles and approaches of noise music. Number 48 is one of the most varied albums out of the entire GRAUSAME TÖCHTER catalog. For me, GRAUSAME TÖCHTER is a group that I really adore the works. I think that it's one of the most consistent EBM and industrial projects out there, and even if this one is not one of my favorite works, I still admire some of the risks they took with the sound in this particular one, and just going into many different styles that kinda reminds me of some of the approaches and the aesthetics that would have in their first album. Number 47 is Kick 3 by Arca. I would consider this to be the greatest out of the Kick series. It is a boundary pushing album with bizarre structures, insanely good production, and definitely one of the most refreshing albums of this year. It is really unique. I don't really think I've heard anything that could go similar to this. The thing that kinda hurts for me is that the album can be a bit inconsistent at times, but with all that being said, this is still one of the most intriguing and one of the weirdest albums I've heard this year. Number 46 is the new album of VALHALL, NEVERSLEEP, which for me it was a downgrade after their previous album, which was one of my favorite works out of the past decade. This one doesn't really seem to capture amazingly what made their previous work and their combination of sounds so spectacular, but still some of the ideas presented over here are excellent, even if it has its flops at some occasions. I really like some of the directions they took with this one and I'm looking forward to more in the future. Number 45 is one of the more underground releases in my list. It's the split between Toshijimikawa and Takeshita, which is a really decent and quite powerful noise release that, in my opinion, if you are into some noise stuff, this is one of my strongest recommendations out of 2021. Number 44, I have Linekraft's ASURA. This is the only album that I ended up not reviewing on my channel. I listened to it much later from its release and I don't necessarily have many things to add about this album in particular. If you're familiar with the sound of Linekraft, I think that this album in particular goes into some really nice directions of power electronics. It has this aggressive and menacing tone that really shines throughout his sound, and in my opinion some of the tracks over here sound really solid. Number 43, I've got Squid's Bright Green Field. Definitely one of the most talked about debuts of the previous year. It was an album that made numbers and I can definitely see why. One of the most exceptional experimental rock albums out of the year, from a year that was actually known pushing the boundaries when it comes to experimental rock music, and Bright Green Field was definitely one of the best ones. Number 42 is Hunter's Morning Tsunami. It's more of the same if you are familiar with Hunter's sound or with the latest stuff of Minute Machine. It has some really nice dark elements and some really cool synth melodies. Other than that, it's more of the same when it comes to the dark wave and minimal wave directions, but it still makes for a pretty solid album for what it offers. Number 41 is the pretty short release of Outro, which in my opinion it's one of the most intriguing post-punk albums that I've heard the previous year. I think that the sounds and the melodies on this one were certainly memorable, and yeah, I ended up enjoying this album more than expected and I was pleasantly surprised with the results. At number 40 is the new album of SUFJAN with ANGELO de Augustine. Even though this album in particular is far from what I'm used to musically, SUFJAN is one of those artists that in my opinion manages to make some pretty solid singer-songwriter stuff that I would end up enjoying, and this is one of those albums. I ended up finding this body of work to be quite appealing and I liked many of the tracks over here. Number 39 is the new album of Garbage, No Gods, No Masters, a nice comeback from the band. It has a really cool nostalgic sound and it ends up being one of my favorite works when it comes to Garbage in general. I think that this is a really strong and powerful album in their entire career. Number 38 is Times of Upheaval by Black Color, one of those industrial and EBM albums that managed to really surprise me and in my opinion had some really cool ideas to it. Not the greatest thing throughout, but still a quite solid album for what it offered. Number 37 is Arcana 1 by Niku Daruma. In this album they ended up going into a slightly different direction the moment I wanted this from them. Apart from the brutal feedback noise, there are synths attached to it, which definitely makes the experience much more moving and sets a different mood, which in my opinion is what the project needed in order to just have a more refreshing route after a series of albums that would just feel kinda similar. Number 36 is HEIRLOOMS Eternal by Human Serpent. In my opinion, Human Serpent have actually managed to do some pretty intriguing albums in black metal over the past couple of years, and I would say that this is definitely one of their best works. They ended up going into a few more melodic routes with this one, and it worked. In my opinion, it made for an album in black metal that it's definitely one of the most intriguing ones from the previous year. Number 35 is another album in the experimental rock scene that managed to do huge numbers, and I'm talking about the new Black Midi album, which in my opinion it's superior from their first, which I wasn't really impressed by it that much, but this one has some really cool ideas to it. I love how weird and confusing it is, but also managing to really intrigue me and grab my attention. This one is a really cool album. Number 34 is the new installment of James Ferraro with Terminus. This in my opinion is the greatest album out of the new running series of James Ferraro, with its more bizarre industrial glitch and modern classical direction, which in my opinion works the best with some of the tracks over here. Even if some of the interludes end up dragging this album down, it still manages to be one of the most exceptional works in the entire James Ferraro catalogue. Number 33 is Ultra Pop by The Armed, which is the album where I saw The Armed really fighting their sound and managing to have their most consistent and most well structured work. The intense production and weird combination of sounds really managed to make this particular album shine and create an identity for The Armed. So yeah, for me this album managed to be a really cool work. Number 32 is A Body of Errors by Luis Vazquez, the solo project from the main member of The Soft Moon, and it really feels like a darker and grittier The Soft Moon sound with some really powerful and engaging instrumentals that in my opinion makes for a really intriguing industrial album that I ended up enjoying quite a bit. Number 31 is this huge 4-way split, which does contain some pretty significant names in the noise scene, and when it comes to some harsh noise and harsh noise wall releases out of this year, this is definitely one of my strongest recommendations. At number 30 is the new album of BIS, which is actually a set of covers, something that I was not aware of prior to my review of this album, but still, the results over here in my opinion are impressive. I really like this album and overall is a pretty enjoyable work from BIS. Number 29, I was stoked for this collaboration. I was really hoping for a good result out of the album of Converge and Chelsea Wolf, and it didn't disappoint. This was an immaculately produced album with some really beautiful ideas throughout. Number 28 is the brand new album of Perturbator, Lustful Sacraments. The return of Perturbator ended up being a different approach in sound, having a much bigger use of guitar and going into gothic rock sounds, and in my opinion it paid off. It actually made for his most well produced album and overall one of my favorite works out of the entire Perturbator discography. Number 27 is GORESHIT's AP2. This is one of the more cheerful and quirky approaches with the sound of GORESHIT, fusing 90s rave sounds with intense breakcore, and I would say that out of everything I've heard in this style, this is possibly his most well executed work. I really liked many of the elements out of this one, and I think it ends up being one of the greatest accomplishments in the massive catalogue of GORESHIT. Number 26 is the debut album of Forest, which is from the main member out of Bluetooth Nord, so if you are familiar and you love the sound of Bluetooth Nord, then you're definitely gonna find many amazing elements out of this album. It will not disappoint. Number 25 is the quite varied and diverse debut album of Operant. This is a really nice fusion of industrial with noise, it has some sick beats, some really intriguing atmospheres, and in general some weird combination of sounds that in my opinion in some occasions they work really good. Definitely one of my biggest recommendations when it comes to industrial music. At number 24, it is another collection of tracks, but what's arguably the most brutal and sickening horrorcore project out there. MC Boospig is back with a really nice set of songs that if you are familiar with the sound, you're definitely gonna find many enjoyable elements out of this. Number 23 is one of the most emotional and powerful musical experiences out of 2021 with a new album of Lingua Ignota, Sinner Get Ready. A nice change of pace with an album that focuses much more on just the modern classical elements, but it still works really fine. This is definitely one of my favorite projects out of Lingua Ignota, and I highly recommend this if you haven't heard this already. Number 22 is The Turning Wheel by Spelling. This album has the perfect balance. It is extremely varied and there is a lot going on to it, but it never gets to the point where it's hard to follow. It's actually quite easy to understand, and it's also one of the most well-produced albums I've heard this year. Every single instrument shines on this one, and like I said, there's a lot going on. So yeah, if you haven't heard this already, it's definitely one of the most exceptional experiences of 2021. I wouldn't say that it's consistent throughout, because some of the risks it takes with many of its different sounds may not be executed that much amazingly, but still this is definitely a strong recommendation from me. At number 21, I was really satisfied with Donda, one of the most anticipated and talked albums of 2021 and also one of my favorite Kanye West albums, period. Now it is a huge project with a lot of tracks, so it ends up having its flaws, but when it shines, it really shines. In my opinion, Donda contains some of the greatest tracks Kanye West has ever written. This is an exceptional album. Number 20, I've got one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. I really like this new album of Halsey, and yeah, it's a bit inconsistent and all over the place, but it was also a big grower on me. An album that caught me off guard. 9 Inch Nails' contribution on this one in the production was spectacular, and yeah, at this point I'm really anticipating for more like this from Halsey, because this was definitely really fascinating. Number 19 is Slater, coming out with a really solid debut album. I really like the directions and the combination of sounds on this one, from pop to hyperpop to house to old school era pop rock. It is an album that for the most part was pretty successful with its risks. Number 18 is the brand new album of Necronomidol, which is one of their most well executed works, especially in terms of production. This album sounds really good. It's actually their best sounding album after a series of very raw projects, and some of their very first ones feeling underperformed as well. So this one sounds quite professional and also big at its best with the vocal performances. A really cool album throughout. Number 17 is the brand new album of Limewax, Untitled. This one could have actually landed much higher if it was just for the material that are contained in the vinyl version, as the actual album contains 3 additional tracks, which in my opinion felt kinda weak in comparison. But still, I really like that this album of Limewax ended up going into a few different directions from what I'm used to, containing elements of like IDM and industrial techno. And it's a really solid album. For what it is, it's just short and straight to the point, and it's definitely worth checking out. Number 16, I've got a collaboration of Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders and the London Symphony Orchestra. What a combination of 3 completely different works, making an album that you can easily consider one of the most essential and significant experiences of 2021 in terms of music. There is something really special about the fusions of those sounds coming together, so in my opinion, this is an album that you should not miss. Number 15 is my one and only Greek release. It is a very short, straight to the point album of Blackout, Σημείο 0, dark, menacing and intense industrial techno. A really good album in the genre that deserves more attention. Number 14 is this collaborative project called Luis and Aaron, which is definitely one of the weirdest and most intriguing albums you can listen to this year. It has some really interesting combinations with ambient and tape noise and sound collage all fused together with some really weird vocal manipulations. If you're into experimental music, this is definitely one of my highest recommendations. Number 13 is the album of Ted Katerska Forbund, which is a really powerful, raw and intense death industrial project with ritual ambient that sounds awesome and has some amazing ideas to it. Definitely one of the greatest albums I've heard in the genre in a really long time. At number 12 is A Diabolic Thirst by Spectral Wound. This album would have actually landed higher on the list back when I first reviewed it. However, I ended up not really returning to this album as much compared to some other works. But still, I do highly recommend this as I believe that it's one of the greatest black metal albums of the previous year, much better compared to its predecessor, with really cool, intense raw production and sick riffs. Number 11, I've got the album Empire of Love by Violet Cold. In a genre that is mostly known for its negativity and its huge history of racism, bigotry, etc., having an album with a more positive impact, it's not just refreshing, but it's a needed album. One of the most vibrant and euphoric albums I've heard this year, and definitely one of my strongest recommendations. And now we're at the top 10, starting with Toshimaru Nakamura's Culvert No Mixing Board 10, another one in the No Mixing Board series, which in my opinion, it's some excellent works from Toshimaru Nakamura. This one is not an exception. Amazing soundscapes, great sounds, great production, and just some really cool ideas throughout. Number 9 is Bait by Harlem. This was my biggest grower out of 2021. I returned to this album so many times. It is a really cool new age and DBM album with great 80s aesthetics. Towards the end, the album would have a bit of a darker and noisier twist, and it's a pretty short album and it's on point. Number 8, I have one of the most solid noise releases I've heard this year. It is K2's Chemical Bomb. It constantly and rapidly changes, it is kinda bizarre at times, and it's just a really cool experience that in my opinion made for one of the most unforgettable experiences of the year. Number 7, it was a huge surprise for me, but I loved the new album of Keith Ape. It had banger after banger after banger. Towards the end, it would also contain some more cool moments that in their own way managed to really shine. There is nothing all that deep or special about it, but it's just such a fun album that I can listen to non-stop. Number 6 is the new album of Boys Noise, which in my opinion is one of the most solid electronic albums I've heard in a while. The thing that shines apart from the multiple stylistic directions is all of the different features that go out of their element, contributing very nicely for the most part in this album. So yeah, it is a really interesting experience that in my opinion it's worth at least giving it a shot. Number 5 is possibly my greatest discovery out of nowhere in 2021. It is the album of Evil Moisture and Expose Your Eyes, Avant Stupid. It is one of the weirdest albums I've heard with elements of avant-garde and noise and glitch, and if you're into experimental stuff, this is definitely one of the most intriguing underground releases you can stumble upon. This was such a great experience. Number 4, I've got By the Time I Get to Phoenix by Injury Reserve. There are so many different words and ways to describe this album, but keeping it short, I would say that this is definitely one of the most groundbreaking hip-hop releases to ever exist. They outdid themselves with this one. This is by far their greatest project, containing some of the most experimental and some of the most out there material I've heard in hip-hop. This is such a unique album and also managing to be really captivating and emotional, serving in memory of one of their members who sadly passed away. At number 3, I ended up putting Minority Report by Kofar. This is one of the sickest and greatest power electronics releases I've heard in a long time. There is nothing that this album does in particular that makes it sound unique or different or exceptional, but it doesn't need to. This contains the pure raw sound that makes power electronics appealing, and it works spectacularly with this particular album. At number 2 is Deform by Funeral Mist. Yes, it's only been like a month since the release of this album, but it ended up landing this high on the list. This is why I wait till the end of the year in order to make my list. It's because of releases like this. Deform might actually be my favorite Funeral Mist album. It's really close with Hecatomb, I can't really choose yet, but this is just an incredible black metal experience, and at this point, Funeral Mist is one of the very few acts that really excites me to see what they're gonna do next in the future. This is powerful, relentless, intense, and also beautiful at times. Such an awesome and incredible black metal album. And finally, at number 1 my top album of 2021 is For the First Time by Black Country New Road. This was one of the most talked about albums of 2021. There was a huge buzz behind it and I can definitely see why. It's in very few occasions where I see a debut album managing to be this promising, and at this point I don't really know how they would ever be able to surpass this. There is an incredible fusion of sounds on this one that even if at some points it might feel a bit familiar, it ends up being its own unique experience. Every single moment over here shines with many different elements, many different ideas and incredible performances. Such a refreshing, beautifully composed album with great musicianship and great ideas throughout. And so yeah, these are my top 50 albums of 2021. I want to thank you all for being part of this journey for another year, and yeah, here's to more in the future. What were your favorite albums out of 2021? Let me know down in the comments. If you like, if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.